Again, thank you all for being here at this it promises to be a fantastic webinar of the Decision Analysis Society webinar series. Let me thank again in advance our speakers, Jim Smith and Jim Dyer. Thank you very much for being here with us. Before starting, you know that I usually tell you some news about the Decision Analysis Society. Now, as you can see from the screen, our main event upcoming on June 22nd, 24, 2022 is the Decision Analysis Advances in Decision Analysis Conference. It will be hosted by the Dartmouth Business School in Washington, D.C. Here is also our website. It's a conference that is going to be in hybrid mode. So if you cannot attend in person, you can, of course, attend and join us virtually. It is the first in-person event of the Decision Analysis Society after quite some time. So I think we are all really looking forward to this in-person meeting and having the occasion to meet so many wonderful colleagues and friends in person. Regarding, let me highlight a couple of plenary events that will be there. We will have three fantastic keynote speakers, Dr. Laureen Meyers, the Cooley Centennial Professor of Integrative Biology and Statistics, Data Science at the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Alex Imas, Behavioral Science and Economics, Basilio Faculty Scholar, University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and Dr. Ali Procaccia, Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at Harvard University. We will also have the PhD incubators and fantastic sessions. And we will also have another plenary event in memory of David Schmeidler, who unfortunately passed away on 17 March 2022. We will have a plenary with four speakers, Manel Bauchels of Dartmouth Business School, Isaac Gilboa, Hec Paris, Massimo Marinacci, Bocconi University, Peter Walker, Erasmus University. Let me give a big thank to Yale, Grushka Cocaine, and Manel Bauchels for organizing the conference, and a thank to all the people who are working in the scientific committee and the programming committee. And now to our two fantastic speakers. Well, by the way, if you're not a member or if you're not renewed your Decision Analysis membership, don't wait too long, do it as soon as it is convenient for you. And now we have these two fantastic speakers of today. Professor James Dyer is the Fondren Foundation Centennial Chair in Business at the Department of Information Risk and Operations Management at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas, Austin. Hi, Jim. His research and teaching interests include risk management, multiple criteria decision-making, and capital budgeting. Professor Dyer is the 2002 winner of the Frank P. Ramsey Medal for Distinguished Contribution in Decision Analysis of the Decision Analysis Society. And our second speaker, or probably will speak first, is Professor James Smith. He is the Jack Byrne Distinguished Professor in Decision Science at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. His research and teaching interests include decision analysis and operations research, particularly related to dynamic decisions and dynamic programming. Professor Smith is the 2008 winner of the Frank P. Ramsey Medal for Distinguished Contributions in Decision Analysis. James, the floor is all yours. And thank you very much again for being here, as well as thank you for all the ones who have joined us today.
Yes, thank you. I think Jim's going to start off the presentation, so I'll turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you. So I am attempting to share my screen. So Jim Dyer, am I doing this right?
It looks good to me.
Okay, good. So a little bit of the background here. So this is David Simchi-Levy organized a conference in honor of the 65th anniversary of management science. And he asked Jim Dyer and I to talk about innovations in the science and practice of decision analysis and how management science played into this. So this is a talk we gave in May 29. So it's a reprise or a reboot, if you will, of that talk. And we wrote a paper following the talk that was published in Management Science, I think just last fall. And the story is Emanuela saw the paper and said, "Oh, would you like to present that paper?" And so that brings us to here. We'll lead off by talking a little bit about what I mean by decision analysis, and maybe this is more important for the audience, the broad management science audience, as opposed to you all. But what do we mean by decision analysis? And Howard Rafa called it common sense reduced to calculation. So we have a little Howard-Rafa decision tree here on the right. So you assess utilities for all the possible outcomes. You assess probabilities for the outcomes. You multiply the utilities times the probability. You add them up, and you choose the alternative with the highest expected utility. So that's what we mean by decision analysis. The procedure goes, way back to Bernoulli, formerly justified by Savage. Pick your favorite, von Neumann, Morgenstern, De Finetti, or Ramsey. So what does research in DA look like? So research in DA can include, for example, how do you get these utilities? How do you assess them? How do you make trade-offs among objectives on the probabilities? What kind of mistakes do people make? How to assess them, and how to combine probabilities from different sources. And so these are examples of research questions. There's also research questions around multiplying utilities and probabilities. Think dynamic programming, think discrete approximations, et cetera. There's also a lot of research around the, say, for example, stochastic dominance, which combines probabilities and utilities. So there's a lot of different ways you can do research, and the research takes somewhat different forms. So, it can be normative research, which is how should I make decisions? It could be descriptive research, which includes, the kinds of common mistakes and heuristics and biases. And also prescriptive, like how should I assess probabilities and how should I combine them? And so management science has really been an outlet for all of these kinds of research, and basically on all aspects of doing decision analysis. So I'll start with a short history, and then we're going to dive into a couple of particular topics. So DA has a very long history in management science, and I will joke that DA was in management science before there was DA, right? So the term decision analysis really was popularized 66, 68 by Ron Howard and Howard-Rafa, but even from the very beginning, management science started in 1954, and in the kickoff, Flood was one of the founders of management science. He highlighted Savage's Foundations of Statistics, probability utility type theory, and he highlighted this as being super important, for the future of management science. And he also highlighted Ward Edwards' more psychological work as being super important. So from the very beginning, there's DA, and there is normative research, and there is descriptive research. So it's been there the whole time. One of the funny things that Jim Dyer pointed out to me was this article on by LA. It's really perhaps the first applied paper on decision analysis in management science. Appeared in 1957. It's 53 pages long, and it's all about mining in the Sahara, and it won the 1957 Lanchester Prize. And this is decision analysis. They're assessing probabilities from experts, assessing the value, estimating the value of mining, and it's really kind of was neat to see. Going on in early in management science, you had Bork writing on utility and attitudes towards risk. You had Fred Hillier in 63 writing about calculating probability distributions for risky investments. You had Hespos, who was at McKinsey, talking about integrating decision trees and simulation and stuff. So it really, it's been there a very long time. The decision analysis department itself was founded in 1970, and before 1969, there were no departments at management science. So it was founded in 1969. There was a decision theory department, and then the DA department was founded in 1970. So Ron Howard was the departmental editor, sort of this one department for about the first 12 years. And then Bob Winkler took over for a period. And so this model was just one editor handling all the papers. And then somewhere around, I think 88, it divided into two different streams, sort of one person handling kind of normative or prescriptive work, and another person handling more descriptive or behavioral work. And that was sort of the structure up until 2012 or so, when kind of went back to one who handled the normative prescriptive stuff and broke out a couple of different departments for more behavioral research. And that was the model until 2018 or so, when David Simchi-Levy came in and sort of combined all these three back into decision analysis. And now it's called behavioral economics and decision analysis. Okay, so a couple of observations here. So one is management science, and we'll try to argue this and give you more detail, has been a key outlet for scientific research in DA with a focus on theory and methodology. So there haven't been a lot of, LA aside, there haven't been a lot of applied work or applications published in management science. So where does the applied work show up? So OR is much more open, if you will, to applied work. Interfaces, which is now called the Informs Journal for Analytics, applications of analytics, and the DA Journal have been much more open to applied work. And a lot of applied work appears in medical journals, for example, or environmental journals, or petroleum engineering. So a lot of it doesn't appear certainly in management science. And honestly, a lot of consulting and corporate applications, they're rarely published. So I think there's a lot more application than we may see. Now, so one may wonder, why doesn't management science have more applications? And it was really as designed. So Churchman was interviewed. Churchman is one of the founders of TIMS and the journal Management Science. Reflecting back on it, he was hoping that management science would be science, and the applications and things would be, OR would focus more on that. So the lack of applications, and it's not that there's been zero applications, but the lack of applications was kind of by design in some sense. So our challenge, what we signed up to do when we agreed to do this talk, was to think about how research published in management science has impacted practice. And if you think about it, it's a little bit hard because it hasn't published a lot of practice. So we can't just point at, this article talked about all this great stuff they did at Chevron or something like that. There hasn't been much of that in management science itself. And so it makes it hard to identify the impact on practice. And so our belief is that there has been a lot of impact on practice, but it's a little bit tricky to kind of tease it out. So we want to think about pulling the thread to reveal some of the connections. And so a better analogy would be like a ball of all kinds of bits of yarn with a lot of threads hanging out of it. So when we think about how it's impacted practice, I'm a big fan of this article that Martin Shubik wrote in Management Science in 1987 about game theory. And this was a plenary talk he gave at Informs. And I love the title, What's an Application and When is Theory a Waste of Time? And Shubik, he was talking about game theory, but I think you could say the same about decision analysis. And he distinguished between what he called three types of game theories: high church, low church, and conversational. And high church game theory is mathematics, axioms, formal solution concepts, verging on arts for art's sake. So to an outsider, this looks like academics talking to each other, not really, there's usually a paragraph about how this helps in applications, but not really concerned with immediate application. And in decision analysis, this would, I think, include like psychological theory or sort of deep descriptive work, as well as prescriptive or normative work. Low church is work on specific applications. So, Shubik's view was that game theory had modest success on specific applications. And I think Jim and I think that decision analysis has had some pretty good success in terms of applications. But, you know, we're always complaining that it's like, why don't we use it more often? So we'd, of course, like more success. But what Shubik was really excited about was the conversational applications of game theory. So, you know, introducing the vocabulary of zero-sum games, non-zero-sum games, making people aware of the prisoner's dilemma. And so this was of considerable worth. And so the big thing here is that Shubik argues that, you know, these applications, high quality conversational applications, wouldn't really have take place without having done the high church research. So that's kind of our basically our takeaway message is that we're going to look at high church research and think about how it has, I don't know, trickled down or impacted conversational and low church applications. So we're going to focus on high church work, mostly in management science, not exclusively, and talk about how it has impacted or could impact. So we're going to do two topics. One is Jim Dyer is going to go sort of deep on the multi-attribute utility side, and I'm going to do probability assessment. And these are just kind of selected topics. There are so many different topics you could do, but why these two? They're really at the heart of DA. They're certainly not the only topics in DA, but we picked these two because it's really at the heart of what we do. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Dyer. So I will stop sharing and then Jim will start sharing. You ready, Jim?
I'm ready. Let's see if it works.
All right, I'll stop. You can start.
Okay. Should be screen sharing now. I'm going to make a change here, and hold on just one moment. And did that work? Is that okay, Jim?
Yeah, it's perfect, Jim. Thank you.
Okay, good. Just checking. Okay, well, as Jim said, we did pick a couple of topics that we thought we'd go into in depth because there are a lot of things that are associated with decision analysis. And when we look back at the work that had been published in management science, certainly work in multiple criterion decision-making or multi-attribute decision-making, that has been a theme that has reappeared in a number of articles that have been published in management science, and so we thought that was worth a look. And frankly, I volunteered to do most of the work in this particular area, in part because you notice on this particular slide it says that some of this work appeared in management science back in the 1960s, and I happen to be old enough to have been around back in the 1960s. So I thought I would talk about some of the work that I was seeing back then, and follow through a bit. Back in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, in management science, there were some articles that were published talking about how do we make decisions with multiple criteria. And we've highlighted a couple of those. Let me see here. My pop-ups aren't working. Sorry.
I had to use the page down button to see them. So
there we go. Maybe that's it. There were a couple of articles that appeared in the early 60s. One was by a gentleman named Terry, and he did a comparison of how to evaluate the performance of different alternatives based on multiple criteria. And in doing that, he looked at rating methods, and he looked at additive weighting. He looked at averaging the ratings. He looked at multiplying the ratings together, and he looked at game theory. And it wasn't quite clear to me how he was proposing to use game theory for that particular purpose. But nevertheless, it was sort of an ad hoc description of different approaches for dealing with multiple criteria that had appeared in the literature, and he had references for all of those types of applications, but no real theory that supported the methodologies. It was pretty much ad hoc. And a little bit later, Eckenrode wrote a similar paper where he looked at how one might go about evaluating alternatives with multiple criteria. And he talked about 6 different methods for doing that. And he talked about 3 different settings or problem types where people would be involved in making judgments about multiple criteria. And he set up an experiment where he ranked these methods based on their reliability and their efficiency. But otherwise, no real theory behind the methodology. The other thing I noticed that appeared in the journal at that particular point in time, or about that time, early 60s, article by Black in 1964. And in 1964, the early 60s, there was a great deal of interest in the federal government for better approaches to allocating resources in the federal government. This was the age of I think, let's see, what was the head of the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and he talked about systems analysis. And so systems analysis became a big deal. And it was associated with something called program packaging and budgeting, PPPS. And so they were trying to rationalize in a very quantitative way the allocation of resources in the federal government. And so this was discussed, and it was a motivation for some interest of the government in this area. And as we will see, the government later funded research associated with doing this sort of thing. On the theory side, the 60s was a rich time in terms of the development of theory. In fact, it went back to some papers that were written in 1959 in the very early 60s. A paper by DeBrew, written in 1959, talked about multi-attribute utility theory and provided a sound theoretical foundation for it. There was other work by people like Krantz, Luce, and Tukey, and so forth in the 60s, essentially economists, mathematicians, and others, but not many people from the DA community that we think about today. In 1968, we had we saw an article in Management Science that was by Fishburne, and Fishburne's article was simply called Utility Theory, and it was a long article. In fact, I think it's worth reading for some of you who might be interested in the history of the DA field. And so he went through utility theory, single attribute utility theory, and so forth. He talked about utility theory for the case of certainty, also for the case of risk. And in his summary article, he included the proposition that you see at the bottom of this slide, which is obviously a very clear statement of the ideas that we associate with multi-attribute utility theory, specifically the additive model. In that paper, he also talked about such things as lexicographic utilities and so forth. But this particular discussion of additive utilities was a nice one. And notice the date, 1968. And I think that's somewhat significant, as we'll see. And in that particular article, he does refer to the earlier work by the people that I mentioned previously. I mentioned earlier that the federal government was somewhat interested in how to rationalize decisions with multiple criteria, and Rand was invited to support some work in this particular area. And there were several Rand memorandums, or memoranda, I think perhaps it is, that are referred to as RMs, that were written in the 1960s, the late 1960s, at about the same time, sponsored by the same program. Ken McCrimmon wrote a nice article that surveyed methodologies for making decisions with multiple criteria, and James Miller wrote a really impressive document talking about using multi-attribute utility theory to assess or evaluate alternative transportation systems. In the same effort, the overall effort at RAND, there was another document that, of course, is very well known to many people. The RM, or RAND Memorandum by Howard Rafa, written in 1969 or published in 1969, that talked about preferences for multi-attributed alternatives. And Rafa did a marvelous job, I thought, at the time, of going through the work that had been done by others, as well as making his own contributions, and summarizing a lot of that work in a way that what I thought was coherent and relatively easy to read. I will comment that that particular RAND RM had a very important impact on my own career. I happened to graduate with my PhD in 1969. I went to UCLA. I started doing some consulting for RAND. And when I walked in, someone handed me this RM. And frankly, it inspired my own work for years to come and was a major influence on my career. As some of you know, there was a special issue of the Journal of Multi-Criteria Decision Making, I think it is, that was dedicated to this particular publication. And it really, I think, foreshadowed the work that that Ralph Keeney and Howard Rafa did in their later book. Okay, I'll move along a little bit quicker. There was other theory that appeared in management science back in those days. Fishburne, of course, had another article. And in his article, he talked about methods for estimating additive utility functions specifically. And he had 24 different methods. He didn't do too much in the way of discriminating among them, but he went through all of them. But in '72, Ralph Keeney wrote an article that appeared in Management Science, I think inspired by work he had done on his dissertation with Howard Rafa. And he talked about some assumptions that would allow other functional forms of utility functions, including the multilinear form. And so that was, again, a paper that was probably developed and eventually made its way into the book by Keeney and Rafa. So a major milestone, as we're all, I think, quite familiar with this particular book, major milestone was the collaboration with Keeney and Rafa that led to the book Decisions with Multiple Objectives that was published in 1976. And that book, I think, is a really marvelous contribution because it includes both, as Jim was saying, high church work, really a rigorous book with regard to the presentation of the theory, but also low church work in the sense that it talked about applications and how one might implement these theoretical ideas in a practical way. And so it was recognized at the time as a major contribution. And in fact, in 1976, it was the co-winner of the Lanchester Prize. So that book really laid out brought together, summarized and laid out in a very nice way the main ideas that we still think about today when we think about multi-attribute utility theory. After that book came out, there were some applications that were published in management science. And so this particular slide shows a list of public sector applications that appeared in '78, a couple of years after the Keeney and Rafa book came out. And so my guess is that one or more of these applications may have been inspired in part by the discussion in the Keeney and Rafa book and by the methodologies that were shown there. So you can see some of these applications, and a number of them were done in the late '70s or the early '80s. And then you didn't see many more. And I attribute that in part to an observation that a colleague of mine at UCLA way back then, Steve Lippman, made when we were talking about publishing an article based on an application of decision analysis or operations research, a new theory that had been developed. And so we were going to use this theory and apply it to a real problem and then hope to publish it. And his observation was, well, the first time you apply a new theory to a real world problem, it is research. The second time, it's consulting. And I always think about that in terms of the novelty of an application. So I think in the 70s, the idea of applying multi-attribute utility theory to real problems, it was still somewhat of a novelty, became less so as time went on. So these kinds of applications, as Jim said earlier, have appeared in other types of journals. And in fact, you see a large gap between the last two articles that were published. There were a couple of other applications that were published in management science, in particular in the military area. A couple of papers dealt with the application of multi-attribute utility theory, actually value models, to making decisions associated with planning for the military. The common name among those authors is Greg Parnell, as you can see, and he's worked with people in applying these methodologies primarily in its context. I did say that these models were models using multi-attribute utility theory that did not include risk or uncertainty, at least not explicitly. And in talking about these particular papers, Jim and I were inspired to write a paper that has appeared recently in Decision Analysis to try to perhaps bring to light for some of the younger members of the decision analysis community some subtle issues associated with making decisions using multi-attribute models in the case of certainty, if you will, not explicitly treating risk, versus the case of risk. One other article that I'll just point out at the bottom of the slide, Don Kiefer wrote a paper way back in 1991 that talked about allocating resources in the private sector. And we found very few of those in management science. In fact, that's the one that stood out as an obvious example, but really didn't see others that were talking about using MAU in the private sector. Okay. As Jim said, pulling that string a bit, MAU has had or multi-attribute utility theory has had I think, a significant impact in areas that have gone off and formed their own communities. And one of those is associated with the optimization of models, optimization problems with multiple criteria. And it turns out that back in 1955, Abe Charnes, Bill Cooper, and Ferguson published a paper in management science on something called goal programming. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest you check that out. But essentially, the decision maker specifies a goal for each of several different objective functions. And then the optimization model tries to come as close as possible to achieving each of those goals. And when you look at the formulation, you can now see it in the context of multi-attribute utility theory as essentially a linear approximation to a multi-attribute utility function. At least that's my perspective. I happen to be fortunate to work with Art Jeffrian at UCLA and Abe Feinberg back in '72. And we talk about a so-called man-machine interactive approach to solving optimization problems, where you would ask a decision maker for trade-offs among the attributes and use those trade-offs to approximate a gradient that could be used in a nonlinear optimization procedure. And on the right, you see some questions from an interactive time-sharing computer program that was written in the early '70s, when those kinds of machines were not generally available to many people, but nevertheless, they were available, and so we developed a the implementation of these ideas in the context of a time-sharing computer. A little bit later, Zions and Millennius and then others developed other interactive algorithms for solving MCD problems. And it became a rich field of research with other people who were interested in optimization of multiple criteria. And eventually that led to the formulation of the International Society on Multiple Criteria Decision-Making. And that particular group has also become part of Informs as the multiple criteria decision-making section. And so there are a lot of people who are very interested in problems with multiple criteria who are also closely associated with that group. Other societies, just real quickly, MAU's had a major impact on medical decision-making. There's a so-called, I shouldn't say so-called, there is a society for medical decision-making that many of you may be aware of. And there was some early work in management science that talked about utility measurement and the development of health status indices that were published in the 70s, the early 70s, about how one could come up with some sort of an index that might be used to make medical decisions, both for individual patients and perhaps for policy decisions. That led to the concept of a quality adjusted life year. And the quality has become recognized as perhaps one of the, if not the major way to evaluate many decisions associated with health outcomes for individuals. And one of the first articles to talk about equality and relate it to multi-attribute utility theory appeared in OR in 1980. And this particular article justified the quality based on the assumptions of Fishman and Keeney and Rafer. And so that particular the recognition that equality was associated with the theoretical basis that came out of multi-attribute utility theory, I think is important. And some medical textbooks still refer to multi-attribute utility theory and describe it to provide that link to the underlying theory. Okay, as Jim said, we're also interested in conversational applications. And I was going through one of my magazines, picked out this particular example. And the example on the left talks about a rating that appeared in a magazine called Car and Driver, a rating for choosing automobiles or for ranking them. And so there are 5 automobiles that are ranked in that table. It may be a little hard to see. The automobiles are across the top. And then if you look to the left, you see a lot of criteria or attributes associated with the automobiles. And they are they're categorized under the major headings of vehicle, powertrain, chassis, and there's one down at the bottom called experience. So what I see there is an implied hierarchy of objectives: the vehicle, the powertrain, the chassis, and the experience. And the vehicle, if you look at those attributes, they essentially relate to how well the car is made, how comfortable it is, how attractive it is, how does it look. And when you think about the powertrain, how much power does it have? How fast does it accelerate? Attributes like that. And you look at the chassis, that relates to how does it handle? Does it corner well and that sort of thing. And then, of course, at the bottom, I'd almost call it a fudge factor. And they had one more thing there. They said, basically, is it fun to drive? So it's a multi-attribute problem. And actually, there's some little numbers just to the right of all those attributes that show you the total weight associated with the attributes. So, for example, some of those attributes are scored from 1 to 5, others from 1 to 10, and others from 1 to 15. Implying, of course, weights on the attributes in addition to the ratings. And so the weights are essentially built in to the ratings that they use. So this is, in my view, a pretty good example of multi-attribute utility theory. There are a lot of things that are kind of right about it, but there are observations, of course, from theory that might be used to improve on the development of these sort of systems. And so today, I think it's important to recognize that MAU provides a coherent intellectual basis, as we said there, for common sense applications. It goes back to the comment that Jim mentioned earlier. This is the quantification of common sense in some ways. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to toss it back to Jim, and let me see if I can escape and get his pictures back up. There you are.
Am I sharing? Let's see.
Yes, it looks good to me.
I'm sharing my screen. Good. All right. Let me see if I can get the chat back up and stuff too, so I can keep on track of that. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about probability assessments. And again, there's a ton of research in this area, and we obviously can't cover all of it, but the basic work here, the foundations are all sort of wrapped up with statistics. And so, as I said at the beginning, you can pick up your sort of favorite axiomatization. Dave Finetti is particularly colorful. And basically he says you, and he's always capitalizing you, are coherent, you have probabilities. And there's a common theme in this Dave Finetti and Savage and Anscombe and Almond of you, so that's subjective, so probabilities are belong to a person, and betting. So those are two things that are sort of, I think, go way back to thinking about probability, and that certainly colors what we see today as well. In early DA research, so when I look at some of the early papers, we've got Winkler, who published in JASA, basically saying there's been very little work on the assessments of probability distributions. And in that paper, he singles out I.J. Good as a statistician who had done some work in this area, but kind of in the statistics literature, it was always the mindset that the statistician and decision maker were sort of the same person. And so and I think that the shift that occurred, in the 67, 68, in the DA view was, we're going to have experts from whom, subject matter experts from whom we are going to assess probability distributions. And so Winkler's early work was certainly instrumental in that. And similarly, he had a paper in management science on combining forecasts. And so these have been two major themes throughout in management science since then. And one of my favorite papers in this theme is the Spetzler, Stale, Van Holstein paper. And this grew out of a lot of consulting work at SRI and sort of identifies best practices for probability assessments. And so I'm going to point out a couple of quick things here. One, this paper, this is how it appeared in the journal. It says exceptional paper above it. And I always wish that my paper would have something like that above it, signaling it as an exceptional paper. What exceptional meant was they had a 10-page limit at that time, and it was long. But in order to be long, it did have to be exceptional. But a funny thing about this, if you Google this paper, the title is Exceptional Papers Probability and Decision Analysis. So all the search engines have picked up the exceptional part as well. But they spent a lot of time in the article and in the interview procedures talking about structuring the interview, making sure you ask the right questions. And these are things like psychologists and lab experiments and things don't, they just hand people the question. And, this paper spent a lot of time talking about the interface with experts. What appears here is a use of reference gambles. So the famous probability wheel. So again, it's betting. It's, your opinion, what is your probability, or what would you prefer to bet on? And so this probability wheel is kind of the literal manifestation of physical manifestation of the Anscombe and Almond's roulette detail as well. So that's an exceptional paper. There was a lot more after that. So just focusing on calibration. There was also a lot of work on scoring rules, on combining forecasts, and just a lot of really nice work. On the modeling side, various ways to assess things, sort of developing more behavioral models of how people form these judgments. There was a very nice review paper in '83 by Tom Walston, and David Budescu. This one got the state of the art moniker, and if you search for that one, it shows up as state of the art in the title as well. But they reviewed all this work on calibration. And so what calibration, the issue that was identified fairly early is that if you ask somebody for a probability, if they say 0.8, it actually happens about 60% of the time. And if you're going to use these probabilities and take them seriously, you want probabilities to correspond in some sense to actual frequencies. And so a lot of this phenomena was fairly robustly demonstrated. And what they found, in Walstein and Budescu writing this review, is saying, well, it certainly happens in the lab, but experts can do pretty well. And the leading example there was of weather forecasters. And I'm thinking of work by Murphy and Winkler, for example. Calibration, I want to just pull out sort of one particular thread in this work, and that is making people think about distributions. So it's like Spetzer and Stale von Holstein in their review, they say, begin by asking, for what's an extreme value, and then think about scenarios that might lead to these extreme values. So rather than, focusing in on a forecast, let's broaden people's thinking at the beginning. Kahneman and Lavello, also in management science, they focus on the idea of considering an outside view. So rather than, let's think like a little bit like a statistician, not so much about the details of the case at hand. And even more recently, Tannenbaum and Craig Fox and others, ask questions different ways. So, what's the probability the Bulls beat the Pistons on March 21st? Or you ask, they play 3 times, what's the probability that, that they win this one game? Of course, it's the same question, but by reminding people that they play a bunch of times, people might start to think that it's, if you win 70% of your games or 60% of your games, you're doing pretty well. And so they find that probabilities that, they call this a distributional presentation, that this presentation makes people think more about the whole distribution. And so this is not a natural way to think. And this is a point that Kahneman and Lavello make very strongly, is that experts are used to, being like Charles Barkley talking about basketball games, all the details of this player and that player. And that's really interesting. And that shows a lot of expertise. But if you're going to think about probabilities, you want to think more like Nate Silver and say this team has a 40% chance of winning, and not sweat necessarily all the details. So that's just sort of one little thread in all this research. And now let's look at some applications. And this is one of my favorite data sets, and I got it from Jay Anderson and Charles Persinger at Eli Lilly. So Eli Lilly has been doing probability assessment for a long time. And there are so many examples in the literature about how bad people are. And this is an example of how good people can be. And so they assess probabilities of success for all phases of R&D projects. They're trained, they've been doing this a while, they have access to historical results, so they know how many phase 1 projects succeed. It's in front of them. They're averaging them to the extent there's disagreement. So they're really implementing these best practices that have been developed for a long time. How do they do? Well, they've been doing this since '97, 1,274 assessments. How well calibrated are they? They're amazing, right? So when they say 50% probability of success, they succeed about 50% of the time, 90% probability about 90% of the time. So I view this as amazing calibration. The only ones that they're arguably a little bit off is 5%, which they only said a handful of times, and they never succeeded. So this is amazing calibration. The other classic example, and this is work by Eric Bickel, and this is kind of more in the conversational mode, and this, back to Murphy and Winkler, and this is more recent than that, but how do weather forecasters do? And this was something that was picked up by Nate Silver not too long ago. Weather forecasters are really good at this. And so this is Eric Bickel's data, 250,000 forecast. When they say 50% chance of rain, it's about 50%. Okay, so again, people taking it seriously, they're trained, and they have the right motivation. If you look at, contrast that with, again, this is Eric Bickel's work, the performance of the Weather Channel. If you look at their 1 day ahead forecast, for example, they give, they're consistently, so when they say 10% chance of rain, it rains about 5% of the time. When they say 20% chance of rain, it rains about 10% of the time. And it's even worse if you look at some different time periods. So they're overestimating the probability of rain at the low end. And they do this on purpose, of course, because people get upset if it rains and they weren't expecting it. And so they are not in the business of betting on their probabilities. They are in the business of keeping their customers happy. So again, it's, think about motivation and in the betting interpretation. They're really lousy about, this is 8 days ahead. No matter what they say, you should think about 25%. And one of the funniest things in this data set is that they almost never say 50%. And in fact, my understanding is that when models came up with 50%, they'd either make it 40 or 60 because nobody wants a 50-50 forecast. They just view that as worthless. So here, the Weather Channel people could be well calibrated, but their motivation is somewhat different. And so the high church concern about having people who are motivated and betting and willing to bet with their things, it doesn't apply here. There's different motivations. And finally, another popular one is 538. So I mentioned Nate Silver already. This I view as an amazing conversational application of probability assessment. So you want to talk about the probability that UNC beats Kansas. Nate Silver had it at 32%. Was he right? Was he wrong? Kansas did in fact win. And if you look at their calibration curves, 538 is very well calibrated. Why? They care, right? They're using sophisticated Bayesian models. Their goal is to give you good probabilities. And again, I view this as a positive example that people, if they're correctly motivated and stuff, can do a good job. And I love this because now people can go around and talk about probabilities of games. And I view that as a wonderful way to get DA thinking out there. So I'm going to wrap up. Maybe we have a couple of minutes for that, for some questions or comments. So the conclusions are that high church research has had a big impact on applications, and both low church real applications and starting to have more and more applications, sort of conversational applications. I think it's really important that DA thinking is still important, even in a big data world. It's like if you can have all the data in the world, but there's an interesting example. If you look at Amazon, obviously they have tons of data, but if you look at any particular product, the vast majority of products on Amazon have less than 10 sales, in over a few months. So even though there's a ton of data and a ton of products, for many of the products, you're still living in a very much small data world. We don't see a lot of the low church applications, conversational applications. Again, I think this is really great. People thinking clearly about trade-offs, people talking in terms of probabilities. And a couple of, just general comments that people who are providing these conversational advice, for example, interpreting COVID test results and things, they should be aware of the concerns of high church researchers, or think about the motivations of the probability providers. Are they motivated? Are they calibrated? And so some of the stuff that, you know, all that we have done over these years, I think is important to people who are providing conversational advice. And I think the reverse is true as well, that when you're doing research, you can think about how it can shape the conversation. So Jim, when we ended this talk, David Simchi-Levy said, "That's great. So what's new? What's next?" And I'll just offer a couple of observations and invite Jim to chime in here as well. The behavioral, when I look at management science and what they're publishing in the DA department, it's really behavioral research that's winning. Covers a variety of different topics and stuff, but much less sort of normative or prescriptive. And we can speculate about why you might think that. I attribute this to Jim Dyer, but there's a lot of really, there are more interesting things you can do, I think, on the behavioral side. And as I attribute this to Jim Dyer, but he denies it. But you know, there's one way to get it right and many ways to get it wrong. And so there's a lot more that you can do, I think, on the behavioral side. And so that's really winning it in the sense of, if you look at journal pages, it tends to be more behavioral. One thing Jim and I talked a lot about is like, what would we like to see more of? And now that we have big data and apps and stuff everywhere, we all have our phones. I'd love to see a Yelp that asks me my preferences for dinner tonight. Right, you know, not just Mexican, but you know, I want the weight I put on ambiance versus price may be different on my, you know, on my anniversary than it is on Tuesday night when I'm just hungry. Other applications, financial engines for retirement planning, this course match system that Wharton uses to help MBA students get courses. These are really amazing, I view as recommended systems. And I'd still like advice on what kind of car to get. Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I think that's a very good summary, Jim. One of the things that I was interested in and have been for a number of years is the idea of the recommender systems. And I would like to see a little more work done in that area. And it would be nice to tie decision analysis to, quote, big data. And I think that that's at least one way to do it. And so it could be a good avenue for research. I've seen a few papers that have been published in computer science journals that talk about utility theory. But when I read those journals, they're coming up with models of choice models that really don't relate in a sound theoretical way to utility theory, either single attribute or multi-attribute. And I think they could learn from us, and perhaps vice versa. Some people from who are quite familiar with decision analysis, who have good computer skills, might be able to enhance those skills and make contributions in that area as well.
I see a couple of comments in the chat about getting the Eli Lilly data, and I've been encouraging Jay Anderson for years and years to, you know, publish a paper on it. And they have given, the Charles Persinger gave a fairly detailed presentation on at an Informs meeting. The data that I presented and a little bit more is in our paper in management science, but it, you know, it's really their data, and they have a lot more to the story. And if you see Charles or Jay, encourage them to finally write that stuff up. So Emmanuel, I don't know how we're doing for time and whether we should open it up to questions, or what's your preference?
I think we can open up. So first of all, thank you very much for the great and important talk. If you want any question from the audience, I see it's also a comment from Bob Bordley. Anyone who wants to speak, I think we have time. I mean, if you can stay here for another 5 minutes.
Manel, I'd love to hear, I see your hand up, Manel Basals. Given that you are, you know, the department editor at Management Science right now, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Right, thank you so much, Jim and James. That was like a really nice overview, and I'm going to go back to some of these old papers. Regarding this list, I just wanted to note that the association model, which we started with Rakesh, and then there's this axiomatization in 2020 with Lin Zhao. this model is intended to be totally normative. So it's just the idea that when you consume, you build up satiation, and that lowers your marginal utility subsequently. And it's entirely normative. And it follows in the tradition of Kahneman, Walker, and Serene paper of another normative benchmark for consumption is the actual utility you will experience over time, if you agree on that as a normative basis for how much utility you get. And then if that could be measured and modeled, it will create a new family of models prescribing what is the optimal consumption bundles and time, and that you should consume over time, that will maximize that time integral, right, of experience utility. So that's in making like a little bit advance on that notion of maximizing experience utility as a normative criteria, if you want to buy into that.
Fair enough. So I see a question in the chat from Brian Putt, and I see your hand up as well. So Brian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Jim. I thought it was a really good presentation. Thanks for all the references and the history. I think that was somewhat discussed a little differently in the 2010 Informs general meeting in San Francisco. But and thanks for the plug for Chevron and the work they've been doing. But I did want to talk about this utility theory and the actual application in large corporations. Or I'm not going to talk about it. I ask you a question. Have you really seen it utilized? I understand the theory about it, and in theory it would work, but then the application and trying to get agreement on what that utility curve looks like is sometimes difficult. Comments?
Yeah, this is funny. It's like, so Jim Dyer and I, like, I guess we have probably clashed over this in the past as well. You go back and look at like Ron Howard's Practice and Promise paper in 1990, and he says that even at SDG, when they were working on big corporate applications, they rarely use utility theory because most of the times the stakes are small enough that it wouldn't make much difference. So they don't. But Jim Dyer has a somewhat different perspective, as I understand and recall.
Well, I'll comment on that. I have seen some applications of utility theory, a very few, in the private sector, and been involved in a consulting opportunity or two where companies have been concerned about maintaining a rather conservative position with regard to their allocation of resources. And so they have talked a bit about being risk averse and tried to quantify that. But I think it's rare. I think it's very rare based on my experience. And then part of the reason, of course, goes back to what we hear from our colleagues in finance, that if you have a major corporation with a lot of shareholders, and the shareholders are diversified, blah, 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 then using expected value as a reasonable criterion for decisions in that context. So I think it's rare in part because of that, the possibility, Brian, that you mentioned, the sense of coming up with agreement about what that utility function should be, as well as the argument from finance that expected values are a good basis for decision making because of the diversification of the investments in a large firm as well as diversification of shareholders. I'd like to hear somebody else's view on that. If there's
so Manuel, how are we? I notice we're at 1:05 now. Do you want to?
Maybe we can take one last comment.
Can I follow up on Jim's point? Jim's question just now. Sorry, Jim Dyer's point just now. So I think you're right that there's different stakeholders in an organization view utility differently. They have different levels of risk aversion. And you end up with this sort of situation where you want to come up with like a corporate level of risk aversion for the decision, But when you're eliciting, you've got different stakeholders looking at things quite differently from their own point of view. So I have a paper under review at the Informs Journal of Applied Analytics, which is the name, Jim, right now, where we actually elicited, and we just went with group utility theory so that you could represent each of the stakeholders in a group decision. And you end up being able to elicit each individual's utility for the decisions, the multi-attribute utility in this case, but individually, and allow them all to sort of speak for themselves. But now you're treating a single organization, which one of the reviewers pointed out, as if it's kind of a group decision. So it really is a problematic area, but I'm on your side, Jim Dyer here. I think we should.
Okay, so a couple of things. There is an observation by Robin saying that QALY is widely used in pharma, and QALY is a form of utility. So I don't know if that increases the chances of using utility, right, in applications. And also a question about whether the slides will be posted. That's also yes. We will. I mean, if the two speakers allow, we will post them below the link for the registration of this webinar.
I'll remind you the paper is published too, so the whole
Exactly.
paper to go with the slides as well. So.
Okay, so there are a couple of messages new. Okay, so but then I think we have to close here. Thank you very, very much again for this fantastic webinar. Thank you all of you also who have assisted and asked questions. It has been a great webinar. Thank you very much, and we will post the recording and the slides. I'll give you my real applause, but I think also the virtual from all the attendees. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.